Having said all that, let me get on and introduce tonight's speaker. We are very fortunate to have once again Bill Fowler. This will be basically Bill's third time speaking to us. Bill essentially is from the North Shore. He is a Boston area person, born and bred. I think the North Shore still thinks of itself as part of Boston, I'm never sure. But in any event, Bill spent almost 50 years teaching at Northeastern University. He has his undergraduate and graduate degrees from Northeastern, and he recently retired after 50 years of teaching just this past July 1st. Bill has written about a dozen books on the American Revolution, also on the French and Indian War, on Sam Adams, on John Hancock, but his real love is the sea, not surprisingly for a North Shore boy. And he has written numerous books on the early American Navy, the Navy in the Revolution, the Navy in the Civil War. This is his most recent, which is going to be the subject of today's talks. By the way, this got a very favorable review back in August in the Wall Street Journal. Some of you probably saw it. It might even be why some of you are here this evening. But in any event, with no further ado, I give you Bill Fowler. Well, thank you very much, John. Can you all hear me in the back? John's introduction lifts me up, but you always have to be careful, because sometimes you can be lifted up and let down. In my last semester of teaching, I was looking at my course evaluations, and I came across one, and this student had checked all of the right blocks. Excellent, 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 onward, onward. Then, the comments section. In the comments section, the student wrote, "If I only had 1 hour left on Earth, I would want to spend it in Professor Fowler's class." Wow. Oh, wow. I turned the page. Because this student wrote, "Professor Fowler's classes last for eternity." There you go. Think for a moment, if tomorrow morning that automobile in your garage could travel 300 miles per hour safely. You could be from the East Coast to the West Coast less than a day. That trailer truck that's passing you on Route 90 could travel at 500 miles per hour. Trains at 600 miles per hour. Airplanes at 2,000 miles per hour. All safely. And all suddenly. That is what happened in the mid-19th century on the North Atlantic. That suddenly, to some it seemed overnight, travel time increased exponentially. How might that affect your life? The products you buy, the places you go, ideas exchanged. It was a revolution. And it was a revolution brought on by steam. Peace. Peace arrives in 1815. The North Atlantic had been at war for 125 years. But now, the Napoleonic Wars are over. Peace between the United States and Great Britain. For the next 100 years, until 1914, the North Atlantic world will enjoy relative peace. Some interruptions, to be sure, but nothing major. It is during those 100 years that two great nations emerge, the United States and Canada, and the North Atlantic becomes this highway, this humming highway between these two continents. In one direction, going to Europe, bulk commodities, foodstuffs for the most part, and tobacco and cotton, to satisfy the needs of a rising European population, burgeoning cities, the Industrial Revolution. Coming back in the other direction, manufactured goods, engines, railroad tracks, and people. This interchange begins to become ever more vigorous in the late 18 teens. Up until this time, traffic across the North Atlantic was conducted by wooden sailing ships. It was wood, muscle, and canvas. These ships did not sail on a schedule. When a vessel came into port, it would offload its cargo and then wait until it had another full cargo to make the return voyage. There was no schedule. If you wanted to go to Liverpool from Boston, you'd travel to Boston and wait. 1 day, 2 days, a week, 2 weeks, until the vessel announced that she was ready to sail for Liverpool. No regular schedule. No ship wanted to sail half full. And then, in 1817, a group of 4 New York Quaker merchants made an astounding announcement. They promised that their line would sail on schedule, on a date certain. One of their vessels would leave New York and another would leave Liverpool. Come hell or high water, fair weather or foul, even in the winter. For in the winter they ordinarily stayed off the North Atlantic. But these men committed to year-round sailing. It was a risky business because you could end up sailing without a full cargo. We know their line because of the burgee, because of the house flag that they flew from the mainmast. It was a red pennant with a black ball. And so this line of ships became known as the Black Ball Line. The first of the packet lines that would sail from New York and Boston, Philadelphia and Boston, providing this regular service. Here you see a black baller coming across the Grand Banks off Nova Scotia. The small fishing vessels there, there's one message that black baller is giving: get out of my way. I slow down for no one. She barreled on through. And there on the foresail, you can just barely see it, the symbol of the line, the great black ball. When the black balls arrived in Boston, people gathered to see it, this magnificent vessel. What news did she bring? Books from Europe and England, newspapers, correspondence, mail, only 6 weeks old. As they sailed by the battery, again, the great black ball there on the foresail. These black ballers made New York this great port. But now it was New York that would handle the bulk of American transatlantic trade. New York held pretty much a monopoly on the cotton business, which might seem rather strange. Cotton isn't grown in New York. But that's where the money was. That's where the ships were. And the pattern of trade was cotton from the American South up to New York, then from New York over to Liverpool, from Liverpool to Manchester to feed Cottonopolis, the textile mills with an insatiable appetite for American cotton. And these packets carried cotton to Liverpool to feed those mills. So the cotton business, the packet business, enhanced New York. And then, in 1825, something else arrived. The Erie Canal. 325 miles, Buffalo to Albany. The Erie Canal made New York City the port for the American Midwest. The Erie Canal connected to the Great Lakes, to Lake Erie, which then connected to the new states, the agricultural states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin. And so all the produce that was being produced in those new states would now find its way down the Erie Canal to New York City. And coming back up the Erie Canal, those manufactured goods that I mentioned, and people to settle in places like Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago. And so the Erie Canal now cements New York's position as the great port. Still the age of sail, and the age of sail, these vessels were prisoners of the wind. And this diagram shows you the prevailing winds in the North Atlantic that these ships had to obey. They are, in the North Atlantic, clockwise. And so it meant the sailing from New York to Liverpool, you had the wind at your back. It's called the downhill voyage. relatively easy. Then you had to return. Not so easy. You're not going to take the southern route, that's just too far out of your way. And so these packets battled the northwesterlies, coming back against those winds. It was a particularly torturous voyage. In the wintertime, ships were lost, men were lost, but it was all in the nature of paying the price for this regular service across the Atlantic. And New York? Oh, here's New York. In the 18th century, this is a wall, which of course is today Wall Street. And then the major street, Broadway, and the Battery down here. In the colonial period, New York was second or third to Philadelphia and Boston. Oh, but that changes. The packets, the regular packets, the cotton business. Here is New York, marching up the island of Manhattan, becoming not only America's greatest port, but America's largest city as well. And it has to do with the commerce. On the other side of the Atlantic, Liverpool, that great port on the Irish Sea, also benefited. Here we see a vessel, the Funchon, coming into Liverpool, and the Liverpool docks too, busy and crowded. Liverpool has a special problem that New York did not have. The tides in Liverpool, the River Mersey, are very dramatic and high, about 30 feet. And so the engineers at Liverpool designed a very intricate system of docks that allowed vessels to come in and have the door closed behind them so that they would remain at a constant level to load and offload. But Liverpool becomes the great, great cotton port. Cotton being imported and people coming out. Wind, muscle, canvas. But there was technology. There was a development here called steam. Steam wasn't new in the early 19th century. It had long been used in England for pumping out mines. It was becoming adapted to work in textile mills as well. But putting it on a boat was a different matter. All kinds of problems there. It's heavy, it's bulky, the vessel needs to be more sturdily built to accommodate this kind of machine, and then you need fuel, wood or coal. So the practicality of steam at sea was problematic. In 1819, a group of American merchants from Savannah, Georgia, had an idea of sending a steamship, an American steamship, across the Atlantic. They purchased a vessel, a sailing vessel that was being built in New York. They renamed her the Savannah. They put a rather rudimentary steam motor here, engine with a paddle wheel, took her down to Savannah, Georgia, and then began their trek across the Atlantic. They made it across in about 30 days, but they only steamed for 3. It was interesting but unsuccessful. But nonetheless, Savannah claims the title of being the first steamship to cross the Atlantic. But it would take about 20 plus years before anybody else would try this. It simply didn't work. In the midst of this, there were New York merchants, however, ship owners, who were very deeply engaged in the packet business and somewhat concerned about steam, but not yet ready to invest. One of these was this man, Edward Knight Collins. Collins comes from Truro, Cape Cod. His father, after the War of 1812, went down to New York, as did many Cape Codders, to enter into the shipping business. Israel Collins was fairly successful. He called for his son, Edward, to come down and join him, which he did. The Collins, father and son, did well. And Edward Knight Collins decided to start his own packet line. He was a great marketeer. He was a great Anglophile. He wanted to appeal to what they called the white glove and cane crowd in New York City, the Knickerbockers. And so he started his packet line and named his ships after great English theatrical figures, hoping to appeal. And so the line became known as the Dramatic Line. It worked, and it worked well. While Edward Knight Collins is managing the Dramatic Line out of New York City, there's another rising entrepreneur. He's a Haligonian, born in Halifax, Nova Scotia. His name is Samuel Cunard. The name was not Cunard. The name was Kunter. Samuel Cunard's ancestors were German Palatines who followed William Penn to Pennsylvania. That's where the family settled. Over some generations, they did reasonably well, developed skills in the area of carpentry. The Cunards, when the American Revolution arrived, split, as did many families. And Samuel's father, Abraham Cunard, was a loyalist. He fled Pennsylvania, went to New York, and then, like thousands of other loyalists, ended up in Halifax, Nova Scotia. There in Halifax, Nova Scotia, he met a young woman named Margaret Murphy, who was a loyalist from South Carolina. And here you see the loyalists arriving here at Halifax. And here in Halifax, Abraham and Margaret met, married, and began to have a very large family. Samuel Cunard was the first and the eldest son. Samuel inherited his father's business, the business of somewhat shipbuilding and land, kind of a multifaceted business. He became a very wealthy Nova Scotian, and he was one of the investors in this vessel, the Royal William. The Royal William was the first steamship to operate on the St. Lawrence River. It went from Quebec to Pictou in northern Nova Scotia. Somewhat like the Savannah, it didn't turn out to be a financial success, but nonetheless, Cunard learned a great deal about steamships from his experience as an investor with the Royal William. And it was in the back of his mind that perhaps this might be the future. And so you have then two men, Edwin Knight Collins in New York City, Samuel Cunard in Halifax, Nova Scotia, both successful ship owners, both clever men with an eye to the future. I don't believe they ever met. They certainly knew of one another, but they never met. Introduce international politics. In the 1830s, we had a rather testy relationship with Great Britain. That testiness generally circled around border disputes between the United States and Canada. Aroostook County, Maine, lines along the Great Lakes, and of course, the impending Oregon crisis in the far west. We had not been good neighbors, by the way. In the past, we had invaded Canada twice, failed both times. The Canadians, particularly the Nova Scotians, were very concerned about these aggressive Yankees. Those of you who may have visited Halifax at one time may remember in your visit that what dominates Halifax is something called the Citadel, huge fortress that was built to defend against the Americans. The Nova Scotians are particularly concerned because they have irregular communication with the home country. In fact, their communication with the home country is more or less dependent upon New York. That's the regular service. So mail destined for Halifax, Montreal, Quebec, generally arrives in New York City and is then forwarded. And they're very concerned that the Americans are reading their mail. They're also concerned that should a crisis break out, reinforcements from England will be a long time coming. And so the Nova Scotians put pressure on Parliament, and Parliament responds, instructing the Admiralty to ask for tenders for someone who will provide regular steamship service between England and Halifax. Who will bid on this? Why are they concerned about this? Because of the time it takes to cross the Atlantic. Christopher Columbus, 1492, 37 days. The Mayflower, 66 days. And the Blackwall Packets, about 35 days. 300 years, nothing had gotten any better. It was still taking as long to cross the Atlantic as it had taken Christopher Columbus. And so it is steamships that will be the answer. But steam is very expensive. That's why the Royal William didn't work. That's why the Savannah didn't work. And so the Admiralty will provide a very hefty subsidy. This is a strategic decision on the part of Parliament to subsidize a steamship service because they know that it can't make money. The bids are submitted. In the meantime, lo and behold, 2 steamships, British steamships, actually arrive in New York City. The Sirius arrives on April 22nd, 1838, and the Great Western arrives the next day, 1838. This is astounding. This isn't the Savannah. This isn't the Royal William. These are real steamships. The Sirius is really too small. She will sort of disappear. But the Great Western will continue. She'll make 45 voyages across the Atlantic. But her problem is, it's only one ship. That's not regular communication. And they're losing money because there's no subsidy for Great Western. She's on her own. Cunard rushes to London, literally rushes to London, gets in about 30 days, to make his bid to the Admiralty. He will provide 4 ships, 4 steamships, provide regular service. He's a ship owner, but what does he know about steam? A little, but not a lot. And so he goes to Glasgow to visit with this man, Robert Napier, this Glaswegian. He's known as the steam genius. He is the steam engineer in England. By this time, mid-19th century, Scotland, and Glasgow in particular, has become the center for steam engineering and steamships. In fact, the Scots almost dominate the business. We know that today, don't we? Well, when Captain Kirk calls down from the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, down to the engine room, who does he address? Scotty. Scotty. Cunard and Napier now form a partnership. Businessman, ship owner, and an engineer. The deal is struck. And here is the ad. The British and North American Royal Mail Steamship. That's the name of the line. The British and North American Royal Mail Steamship. But everybody just calls it then and calls it today the Cunard line. And here's the schedule between Halifax and Liverpool, and Halifax and Boston, and Halifax for Liverpool. Regular schedule now by steamships. Voyage time, we're going to start around 12 or 13 days. Think of that. Think of that. It's 1/3 the time that the sailing vessels operate. Here are Cunard's orders to his captain, the first captain. It will be very obvious to you that it is of the first importance to the partners of the Britannia that she attains the character for speed and safety. Speed and safety become the hallmark of the Cunard line then and today. Cunard proudly boasts today, although today is a subsidiary of Carnival Cruise Lines, but nonetheless, Cunard still boasts it has never lost a passenger in peacetime. And that's true. Wartime's different, but they've never lost a passenger in peacetime. And so these are the instructions to the captain. The first vessel is Britannia. There will be 4, Britannia, Acadia, Caledonia, and Columbia. Note, by the way, 4 vessels, they all end in IA. And that again becomes the tradition of Cunard, that the names of their vessels will end in IA, with the exception of the Queen's. Another thing to note, the funnel of the Britannia. It's kind of a strange orange with a black boot top. The original intention, Cunard's original intention, was to be a red funnel with a black boot top. But after they had affixed the funnel, started up the boilers, the furnaces, the heat coming up the funnel changed that red to this kind of strange orange color. Cunard told Napier, change it, paint it red. Napier, being a thrifty Scotsman, said, that's what you got, that's what you got. We're not repainting it. And so this orange color became, and remains, the hallmark of the Cunard line. Even the great queens today, Queen Mary, Victoria, Elizabeth, all have this color on their funnels. And so the business begins. Britannia sails on July 4th, 1840, from Liverpool. By the way, in the newspapers of Liverpool, there is no mention of that special date. She arrives in Halifax, about 12 days, leaves Halifax, comes down to Boston. The route that was agreed to was Liverpool, Halifax, Boston, Boston, Halifax, Liverpool. New York at this moment is not in the picture. It will be, but originally it is not. And here is the view of Britannia entering Boston Harbor, done by the very well-known American marine painter Fitzhenry Lane. The ship was received with great acclaim. This was Boston's triumph over New York. What could be better? In honor of the visit and the establishment of this communication, Boston merchants take up a large collection and commission the predecessor to Shreve, Crump, and Lowell, a company called Ball and Low, to fashion a great silver cup. And this is the cup. It's called the Boston Cup. It remains on exhibit today in the lobby of the Queen Mary II, a symbol of Boston's triumph, one of the great maritime treasures. There were some problems, of course. There's winter, you know, in Boston. The harbor freezes over, and on one occasion, Cunard would pay a penalty if his ships were late. And so Britannia was caught in the ice. Again, the Boston merchants came to the rescue, hired a bunch of crewmen, teamsters, workers. They cut a channel through the ice so that Britannia could sail on time. So Britannia now and her three sisters become frequent visitors to Boston on a regular basis. Mr. Collins watches this very closely. He has moved out of Manhattan. By the 1840s, Manhattan has become crowded and dirty. He moves up out of the city and builds a home on a vast estate which he calls Larchmont, which is today Larchmont, New York. And this is the house that Mr. Collins lived in, still standing today. Collins has become fascinated now by what Cunard has done. He's also a patriotic American. He dislikes the Brits winning. He declares there is no longer chance for enterprise with sails. It is steam that must win the day. And so he sells his ships. He sells the dramatic line to raise capital because he's going to go into steam. But he knows well that at the moment there's no profit in steam. And so while selling his ships, he also begins a massive lobbying effort in Congress for the Congress to award him a subsidy similar to the one Cunard had to establish a steamship line. It works. He manages to get a rather handsome subsidy from the Congress to build and operate these ships. And he creates the United States Mail Line to compete one-on-one with Samuel Cunard. He's going to build his ships here. This is the East River. Along the East River, first half of the 19th century, shipbuilding, foundries, docks, all along here. And it's along this river now that Collins will build his vessels. The Novelty Iron Works is in charge of building the engines and the boilers. This is a massive effort. These are huge pieces of machinery, complicated pieces of machinery to power these vessels. Inside here are the boilers. You can see a gentleman standing there. The boilers are huge. The cylinders driving the engine are about 90 inches tall, about 50 inches in diameter, and must be done with great precision, which at this point the Americans have a little challenge there. We don't yet have a Napier. Collins builds 5 vessels: the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Arctic, the Baltic, the Adriatic. He follows Cunard's little cloying thing. All his vessels end in IC. This becomes a matter now of national pride. Congressman Edson Olds from Ohio. We have the fastest horses, the prettiest women, and the best shooting guns. And we must also have the fastest steamers. Nothing short of this will answer the expectations of the American people. And the subsidy depends upon Collins satisfying the expectations of the American people. Not everyone agrees with Collins, agrees with Olds. James Gordon Bennett does, the New York Herald. and is a newspaper that constantly supports Collins's efforts. But there are others who have some questions. Yeah, it is corruption. The evil in this case is that Congress was not deluded, it was corrupted. And so from the very beginning, there's great skepticism. And then there's something else. This is the late 1840s, we're moving into the 1850s. We are headlong moving towards civil war. Sectional divisions. Southern congressmen see Collins's subsidy as a Yankee scheme. Where are these ships being built? In New York. Where are their engines being produced? In New York. Where are the bankers financing this? In New York. On and on. They see it as another example of northern economic aggression. And so there's a rising discontent in the Congress, pretty much on a sectional basis. There's also a certain Jacksonian approach too. Andrew Jackson was much against subsidizing big business. And this seems so blatantly anti-Jacksonian. It strikes at the heart of some of the members of Congress. And so they oppose it. A cartoon that appeared in one of the newspapers shows this rather well. This is John Bull. John Bull was the 19th century symbol for Great Britain, like our Uncle Sam. Here's John Bull, and John Bull has a mechanical bellows that he's blowing. And this is Samuel Cunard here. So John Bull has a mechanical bellows assisting Cunard to blow his vessels across. And over here is Uncle Sam looking down at Edward Knight Collins, and poor Mr. Collins can only manage all the power that he can get from blowing through his cheeks. Clearly unfair. And a wise man standing here, sitting there with an owl sitting on his shoulder, determined. So clearly, the message here was Cunard had support and Collins did not. Collins, though, was persistent. And again, the great marketeer. This is an age when the master of a packet ship or a steamship was a local hero, an icon. You might determine what vessel you would sail on by who commanded the vessel. You would ask, what captain is master of this vessel? What was the last time you did that when you got on the shuttle to go to New York? Did you care who the pilot was? In the 19th century, it was very important. These were heroic figures. And Collins hires heroic figures. Captain James West, dashing man, is the master of the Atlantic. She's setting speed records. West is a dashing figure, very dashing figure. Collins conjures up an occasion here for great publicity. The most famous singer in the world, maybe the most famous personage in the world in the mid-19th century, was Jenny Lind, the Swedish nightingale. P.T. Barnum, America's greatest huckster, conjures up a scheme to bring Jenny Lind to America for a one-year tour. She gets $10,000 an appearance. It's a colossal amount of money. But if Jenny Lind is to come to America, she must come on an American ship. And so Collins and Barnum work out an arrangement. Jenny Lind will come to America on James West's ship. And she does. When the Atlantic arrives in New York City, 50,000 people are there to welcome Jenny Lind and the Collins steamer Atlantic. Collins wins that publicity war. He also provided elegant service, the best food. He actually carried live lobster, if you wanted it. All kinds of food. Cruise ship cuisine, I suppose we would say today. Quite in contrast to Cunard. Cunard was rather conservative. They said that Cunard's menu didn't change for about 50 years. Collins also offered such amenities as a barbershop, steam heat, which was valuable in the wintertime, everything that you might want. His ships were far more elegant and larger, and of course that was the good news, the bad news. Good news, attract people. Bad news is they were much more expensive to operate. More lobbying. Captain Gustavus Vasa Fox, master of the Baltic, is instructed to go to Washington. Sails up the Potomac River, anchors off Alexandria, And 2 or 3 days of grand parties. Everybody comes. Every member of Congress and the president himself comes to be lobbied by Collins and the others. Collins manages just barely to keep his subsidy, but there's a rising anxiety here. But he does set records. The Baltic, 1854. 9 days, 16 hours, and 16 minutes. Compare that to Columbus, the Black Ball Liner. I might add, by the way, that the record for crossing the Atlantic is still held by the United States, by the ship, the United States. 1952, she crossed in 3 days, 10 hours, and 40 minutes. That record is yet to be broken. This vessel today, the modern one, is laid up in Philadelphia. She'll never sail again. So Collins does deliver. Speed. 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 The speed is dangerous. Very dangerous. In September of 1854, Arctic is on her westbound passage, Liverpool to New York. This is the time of year when off the Grand Banks, off the coast of Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, fog is common, almost ever present, in fact. Arctic is steaming along at about 13 knots, which is fairly fast. She has no warning devices. There are no bells being sounded, no whistles. She has lookouts up forward, to be sure. But she steams ahead, very steadily. Captain James Luce, the master of Arctic, wants to set a record. He wants to break Baltic's record. And so he will not reduce speed. In the meantime, while Arctic is coming in this direction, just off the coast, south coast of Newfoundland, there are 2 small islands, French then, French today, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. They were the bases for the French cod fishing industry. It's now early fall. Cod fishing season is over. And so the cod fishermen from France who had been there on Saint-Pierre and Miquelon are going home. And they're traveling home on a small schooner called the Vesta. The Vesta is outward bound then, coming down around Cape Race, heading in this direction. She's an iron-hulled vessel, smaller than Arctic to be sure, and steam-powered. She too is steaming at a fair rate of speed, heading east. It is about noon. Lookouts forward. The captain has just done, Captain Luce, has just done his dead reckoning position to figure out where he is. He's just retired to the saloon down below for lunch. Went up on deck. The lookout calls out, "Steamer, steamer, steamer." Coming out of the fog, literally only a few hundred feet away, is the Vesta, bound dead on for the Ark. And here you see the Vesta slamming into the starboard side forward of the steamship Arctic. Luce immediately comes on deck. When he sees what has happened, he's concerned that Vesta is sinking. And so he dispatches one of his boats to her rescue. That boat and Vesta disappear into the fog. In the meantime, Arctic's damage is critical. The carpenter quickly reports to the captain, it's fatal. The vessel has about 3 to 4 hours to last. What then happens over the next 3 hours or so is panic. This is in the days when there were no lifeboat drills. You didn't have a life jacket hanging in your closet. You didn't know what life station to go to. The crew hadn't been trained either. The crew panicked. There are only about 4 boats on the vessel. You can only take a fraction of those aboard. There are almost 400 people aboard. The crew seizes the boats, takes off. In the meantime, many of the passengers build a raft and cling to this raft. It is September, so it's chilly, it's not yet winter. but hypothermia will set in. You're in the water about 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so. Gradually, that night, everybody except one person slips off that raft. In the next few days, other vessels traveling through there will pick up some survivors. Altogether, about 85 people survive. About 61 passengers and 24 crew. Not a single woman or child. All of the survivors are men. Arctic goes down. One hero in this, the cabin boy, Mr. Holland, who stands by the gun. Small cannon there. Firing off the gun, hoping that someone will hear it. No one does. Among those who go down with the ship, Collins' wife, and his daughter, and his son are lost. It's a personal tragedy of great intensity for Edward Knight Collins. The wreck of the Arctic becomes infamous as people begin to realize what had happened. What had happened out there off the coast of Newfoundland. The company takes a severe blow to its reputation and its business, obviously. As if that wasn't enough, at about the same time, another threat surfaces. The Commodore, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Rapacious robber baron. Very wealthy, had built an empire in railroads. Transportation is his thing. So now he eyes steamships. But Vanderbilt's way of doing business was rather curious. He would come to you, whatever business you happen to be in, and he would announce to you that I'm going to start a company that's going to compete directly with you. He has very deep pockets, so it's a meaningful threat. He would then wait for your response. And in so many instances, the response would be, "Oh, Mr. Vanderbilt, can we pay you not to do that?" Which he was perfectly happy to do. And so he approaches Collins, makes that pitch, and Collins refuses. So Vanderbilt begins to compete. It doesn't last very long. Vanderbilt realizes, too, that there's probably not a lot of money in this. But the challenge from Vanderbilt poses a real threat to the Collins line. And then the following year, the Collins steamer Pacific, bound from Liverpool to New York, disappears at sea. All hands lost. 2 vessels down now. 2 vessels gone. Collins tries to persist with the vessels that he has left. But now he has not enough vessels to fulfill the contract that he's made with the Congress, giving ever more reason for the Congress to remove the subsidy, which they do. Without the subsidy, there can be no future. And there's an auction. April 2nd, 1858, the Collins ships go up for auction. They're gone. So, the Collins line is no more. Cunard continues to move forward. In 1862, the Persia. She's an iron-hulled vessel. This is relatively new. Still powered by side wheelers, that's true. But there are more and more Cunards now. Weekly service from New York and Liverpool. The North American Royal Mail Steamship. The Asia, the America, the Canada, the Africa. All of these vessels, all ending in IA, providing this regular service now. And something else begins in 1862. Up until 1862, Cunard and Collins never carried immigrants. It wasn't profitable. When you think of these steamships in the early days, so much space has to be devoted to machinery, so much space has to be devoted to fuel, wasn't much space left. What's the most valuable, highest paying cargo you can carry then or today? People and mail. Carrying immigrants in those steamships wasn't profitable. But as the steamships get bigger, as the engines improve in efficiency, there's more space, they begin to carry immigrants. And they will carry between the American Civil War and World War I, they will carry millions of immigrants. But originally they did not. And then the Civil War devastates what's left of the American Merchant Marine. The Confederates, this is the Confederate raider Nashville, destroying the Harvey Birch, American clipper ship. 1/3 of American tonnage disappears during the Civil War. Now, a good part of it was destroyed by vessels such as the Nashville and the Alabama, but most of it was the work of American ship owners. Insurance rates were going up. And so what do American ship owners do? They change the flag on the stern. It's no longer an American ship, now a Portuguese ship, a Swedish ship, French, whatever you like, which will make it a neutral vessel, not subject to capture by the Confederates. After the war, those vessels do not return to the American registry. They stay foreign. The American Merchant Marine goes into a decline from which one can argue it has yet to recover. Baltic does go on to one final moment in history. It is Baltic that in April of 1861 is dispatched by President Lincoln to remove the garrison at Fort Sumter. So Major Robert Anderson and the Union garrison at Fort Sumter are brought back to New York by the Baltic. Kind of their last moment in history. By the end of the century, this is a poster that advertises the great shipping lines in the North Atlantic. All of the funnels, each line having its own particular combination of colors and symbols. Not a single American line is here. Not one. Not one. They're all foreign lines. If your ancestors came to the United States in this time period, post-Civil War, down to World War I, perhaps even into the 1920s, if they came by sea, they almost certainly came on a foreign vessel. On the British side, the dominant lines are the Inman Line, Cunard, and the White Star Line. They dominate the North Atlantic. Oh, there are ships under French flag and some German flags, that's true. But these lines are the dominant figures now, not a single American line. Mr. Collins and Mr. Cunard, how are they remembered? Collins is buried in an unmarked grave in the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York. When he died in New York City, his family spent the next 20 years battling the will. By the time the battle was over, there was nothing left. So there's no monument to Edward Knight Collins. In Halifax, there's a splendid monument to Samuel Cunard, recognized there as one of the great figures. A bit of irony there, of course. A great Haligonian, to be sure. He is a Nova Scotian, he is a Canadian, but most people assume that he was British. He does indeed retire to London and dies in London. Sir Samuel Cunard in 1865. So he is remembered, Collins not so much. The legacy? Who wins in the end? Who really wins in this titanic struggle? New York City. The packets? Cunard. New York City is the port. She wins. Boston has a little bit of memory here. Not quite as visible as Statue of Liberty or the Queen Mary. That's a Cunard ship right there. You can see the funnel. For those of you who might work in the city or get downtown on State Street, 126 State Street, right here, this is the front door, 126 State Street is the Cunard Building. In fact, if you step across the street, you can read Cunard Building. It was not the Cunard Line today, but it remains as a symbol. And then, just recently over in East Boston, some engaging entrepreneur has opened a new tavern, the Cunard Tavern in East Boston. Quite appropriate, by the way, because the Cunard Wharfs were in East Boston. Thank you all very much.
entertain a few questions. I suspect
Only
quite a
easy
few.
questions.
Okay. We can't promise that.
Please. Yes, sir.
In line with the current trend on the internet to dream up conspiracies, has anybody ever investigated or thought of the fact that these two ships went down with such an impact to the shipping company that there might have been some help or something involved?
Well, certainly the sinking of the Arctic is clear, collision. The Pacific disappears. Most likely, and again, it's most likely, she hit an iceberg, okay, which was, well, we know about icebergs in the North Atlantic. There was some debris found at a later time, doors and that sort of thing. Probably not any intentional thing here. One, human error, clearly human error, and the other is nature probably, the time that she was sailing. Because the ice was rather common actually that time.
Can I follow that up?
Sure.
The ships that did collide,
Yeah.
didn't they have any sort of system to keep track of each other or understand where each other were?
Nope, no. What does happen after this, Matthew Fontaine Murray, who was the great oceanographer, recommends that in the North Atlantic they put up traffic lanes. It doesn't really work, you know, that ships sailing from east to west should be in the northerly lane, so no, there is no regulation. No, there is not until 1914 really, it's what's called the Safety of Life at Sea Convention. Is there any international action to attend to safety of life at sea? But that's not until 1914, and that's a direct result of the Titanic disaster. But in the 19th century, no. Freewheeling, very freewheeling. Yes, sir.
Cast iron only has 30% of its strength in torsional or impact loads. It's very, very strong in compression when it's squeezed. So if it hit an iceberg, it's very weak.
Yeah, it's brittle almost.
Brittle.
Yeah, it's brittle. That was one of the reasons why why iron-hulled ships were slow. One would think immediately would recognize iron would be better, but precisely for what you said, there were real downsides to iron as well. Yes, please.
You said that no women survived.
Yeah.
And there was obviously no intention to help them survive, I guess. Obviously, the Titanic, that was the big thing.
Right.
When was the moment that this...
That's a very good question about no women and children surviving the Arctic disaster. When did all of this change? In 1852, 2 years before the Arctic disaster, HMS Birkenhead, which was a British troop ship, was carrying troops from one port in South Africa to another. She hit a reef and was going down very suddenly. On board the troop ship, regiment of troops, and families, what happened was that the colonel of the regiment summoned the soldiers to attention on the deck and required them to remain at attention on the deck while the women and children were evacuated. And they were. Nearly all the soldiers died, but many of the women and children survived. The Birkenhead incident set a standard, and that was one of the, not time to get into this, but that was one of the reasons why the Arctic disaster got such publicity, because everybody compared it to what had happened to HMS Birkenhead. Rudyard Kipling later writes a poem called The Birkenhead Drill, about women and children first. It's not a law. It's not a law, but it certainly becomes the tradition of the sea in this late 19th, early 20th century. On board the Titanic, you can analyze the loss in the Titanic, and there are some challenging things when you look at class. I mean, how many people died in each class? But the fact of the matter is that more women and children survived than men. So in the Titanic, women and children fared well if you eliminate class. So yeah, so it's evolving. Yes.
The Birkenhead as a troop ship, would it have had more small boats aboard it than the Arctic, which you said I think had 4 boats?
The question was, would Birkenhead have had more small boats aboard? The answer is no.
Okay.
The regulations regarding small boats aboard these vessels was quite antiquated. Not to get too technical, but a certain number of boats were required up to 10,000 tons. Then after 10,000 tons, you didn't have to have any more boats. The standard for carrying lifeboats was not based upon the number of people aboard. It was based upon the tonnage of the vessel. When Titanic went down, she had absolutely the correct legal number of lifeboats. Even though she had only lifeboats for about a third or a half the people on board, it was perfectly legal. Those were the regulations, as strange as that may sound. Yes, sir.
The stats you gave for sailing, I assume were westbound, and then
Yeah.
the number of days, and then the record was eastbound.
Yes.
What are the other times? Like how long does it take to sail eastbound and to steam westbound?
Well, the eastbound voyage would usually be longer. Westbound voyage would usually be longer because even steamships are affected by wind. The average time, Baltic sets a record, 9 days and something. The average time was 10 to 12 days, and that remains pretty much the same until the late 19th century, when we have the development of more powerful engines, particularly steam turbines, which then cut the time. Aquitania, Mauritania, crossing in 5 days or something like that. Yeah. So, yeah, fairly fast. Yes, back there, please.
To follow up on that question, so what was the number of trips they would take in a year?
Oh,
I mean, given, they land.
well, you usually want it, I'd have to figure that out, but it'd be 2 or 3 days in port, okay, because it's going to take that long to recoal. So, yes. And that's why it was important to have a minimum, they used to think a minimum of 4. Today, in the 20th century, is a minimum of 3 ships. When Cunard, in the 20th century, they had 3 fast vessels, Lusitania, Aquitania, Mauritania. And they were concerned, those 3 vessels could provide what they refer to as the express service. So it's 5 days, 5-something hours back and forth. 2 vessels and a third in reserve. So they had it figured out very well. So yeah, 5 days, 6 days across, and probably a couple days in port to refuel and then refit whatever needs to be done. Yeah, yes, please.
How about European countries, Germany, other places? Were they competing or?
Good question. Were other European countries competing? The answer to that is yes, but a little bit later. The principal competitor to the British lines are the Germans. But keep in mind, there is no Germany until 1870. It's the unification of Germany in 1870, first Kaiser Frederick and then Wilhelm. Kaiser Wilhelm II, some of you may know this, is of course the grandson of Queen Victoria. And the Kaiser Wilhelm, is a very competitive guy. And so he begins to push, as other Germans do for that matter, to build powerful German ships, passenger liners, and they do. The North German Lloyd line and the Hamburg America line. 2 very large German companies build very fast vessels, in some instances actually beat the British. So the Germans become the principal competitors, which of course is hurtling us towards, part of the element hurtling us towards World War I. There are other lines too. The French have a line, but they're not, and the Dutch as well. But it's really British versus the Germans in the late 19th, early 20th century. So there is competition, yes. Yes, sir.
You talk about the impact of railroads, if ships coming to Boston and going to New York.
Yeah. The impact of railroads, another good question. What people, not so much Collins really, he kind of missed this. Cunard didn't miss the point. Cunard came to Boston. One of the reasons he came to Boston was because at that time we had good rail connections to Canada. And so Cunard saw the interlinking, okay, of ships and rail, kind of the single ticket passage, Vanderbilt, the great railroad magnate, saw that. And then in the late 19th, early 20th century, J.P. Morgan forms this vast conglomerate called the International Mercantile Marine that combines numbers of shipping lines with railroads. The point was that you could put your cargo on a vessel in Liverpool or Bordeaux or Marseille or wherever you wanted, and it was a single through ticket. So that your cargo, or a person for that matter, would arrive at the ship, get on the ship at Liverpool, and it would be a seamless passage all the way to Milwaukee, okay, or to Des Moines, wherever you were going. So that was always the goal, was to have a sort of continuous, seamless kind of thing. Kind of like FedEx, Just you put it in the box, and you know it's going straight through. So that was always the goal. Yes. Yes, sir.
When was a screw propeller?
Question about the screw. Screw propellers were around, certainly available in the 1830s. They didn't, these major, Cunard and the others, did not convert to screw propellers until 1860s or so. It's a challenge, it's a new technology. One of the principal problems with the screw propeller is you have this long shaft going the length of the vessel and going out through the stern of the vessel. And they had a lot of trouble preventing leaks, frankly. Okay? So that technology has to evolve and develop. When it does, it's immeasurably important because the screw propeller is much more efficient, okay? Uses less fuel, takes up less space because now you don't have those huge paddle wheels. And that is one of the elements that gives more space on the ships that allows these ships to take low-paying immigrants. Yes, sir.
I'm curious as to what these ship owners would do as far as using the sails to assist the actual engine across. I mean, if they had like a 20-knot breeze, they automatically throw up.
The sails on these vessels were very important. A, for auxiliary power, to be sure. Also, they don't know it's going to work. You know, up until the 1880s, the Royal Navy required sails on their warships. It was only when warships in the Royal Navy turned to twin screws, that is, 2 screws in there, then they thought, well, we got a backup. But if you had only a single screw, that was a little worrisome. So they needed it for that kind of backup. Also, keep in mind that on these paddle wheels, one of the great disadvantages, ships roll. And so you could have your port paddle wheel out of the water, your starboard paddle wheel, you know, so the sails could be used to stabilize the vessel. Okay? Not just to help propel it, but actually help to stabilize the vessel so that your paddle wheels were digging into the water in a reasonable fashion.
Maybe a couple more questions, and then we'll give Bill a break. He is, by the way, going to be signing copies of his book, which will be on sale there for not $31.88, but $32, if you don't mind donating 12 cents. It'll make everybody's life much easier. But a couple more questions? All right?
Yes, please.
What are you going to do next?
What am I going to do next? Well, I am fascinated. That's a great question. You know, it's always, yeah, good question. I already have the title. Yeah. It's going to be Full Ahead to Armageddon. And if I can work this out, as an author, you know, the first thing you have to have as an author, you have to have a story. Okay? What's the narrative? What's the story? Then you get the facts. I know that myself. But first you have to, what's the story? What's the story? And I think the story is about, related to this tremendous rush of technology, steam, and this competition that was asked about between Germany and Great Britain. The introduction of new kinds of technology, the turbine is very important, steel, the turbine, and melding that with the naval rivalry as well. It's this dreadnought period when these two imperial powers, Great Britain and Germany, are building ships bigger in a race. And then, of course, it culminates in 1914.
Yes.
So I'm trying to work that out in my head.
That's Armageddon.
I'll try to work that out in my head, but it's still a little fuzzy. What I need is a long drive alone. Without any question.
That was a great final question, but I warned you it wouldn't be easy, Bill. So thank you again very much.